All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. This is the STIF Discretionary and Statewide Transit Network Program Reporting Overview webinar. I'm Patrick DePriest. I'm the STIF Discretionary and Intercommunity Program Coordinator, and with me today is Janelle Hull, who's going to help out with webinar support. I will note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available online on the STIF website. Now I will turn it over to Janelle to talk about the webinar ground rules.
Hello everyone, my name is Janelle Hull and I'll be helping with webinar support today. You may notice that you're muted and you'll be muted throughout the webinar. However, there will be opportunities to ask questions. So if you have a question, please use the question box in your far right panel and we will answer all questions at the end.
All right, I'm going to start with a quick overview of the topics for today's webinar. So this does concern reporting for the STIF Discretionary and Statewide Transit Network Program funds. As a reminder, the Statewide Transit Network Program includes both the STIF Intercommunity Fund as well as the 5311F Fund, and those will be reported through the Quarterly Agency Periodic Report, or APR. I'm going to get into talking about project progress reporting as well as outcomes achieved reporting. I will talk about submitting project documentation both through the APR and through the reimbursement request documents. I will talk about the STIF low income tax mitigation reporting requirement. And finally, we will do a brief demo of the new STIF additions to the APR. So the STIF discretionary and STN reporting largely mirrors that of past discretionary grants that the recipients on the line today likely have participated in. It is reimbursement based, and the reimbursement requests for this for these funds are only accepted following the submittal of a quarterly APR, with the exception of vehicle purchases, which may be submitted in advance of the quarterly APR. Our goal with formulating this reporting process was really to keep it as streamlined and simplified as possible. We wanted to reduce the burden to the recipients and make reporting easy, particularly given the burden that you have had with coming up to speed with the formula reporting requirements. As a note, because this is in the APR, all pre-existing APR requirements are unchanged. So there's a lot of other content requested of agencies in the APR, such as vehicle condition, updates to vehicle conditions, and all of those requirements are still in the APR. Rather, this is just an addition to the grant information tab for the specific program. So per the OARs, recipients will report on 3 things, and that includes expenditures, which they'll do through reimbursement requests, project progress, and outcomes achieved, the latter 2 of which you will report through the APR. So we're going to dig in a little bit more to project progress and outcomes achieved and what those categories mean. So project progress is going to be measured or looked at a couple different ways. We'll look at the reimbursement request submitted, and so this gives a sense of the amount of funds that were expended each and in which task categories. So it gives RTCs a sense of how far along the grant is in terms of the funds. Additionally, we will request updates on project deliverables provided by the recipient. So this is really looking at those deliverables that were identified in your statements of work and providing updates as to them. And this is going to help the RTCs both get a sense of any challenges of project implementation so far and also what to expect in coming quarters. So I've added an example here of what project progress could be, and here that would be a purchase and installation of a new bus shelter near a public library. So it's really just getting to the actual action taken to complete a deliverable. Now, outcomes achieved, on the other hand, rather than looking at progress on deliverables, is seeking to learn about the broader benefits of the project, both to the public and to the statewide transit network. So all recipients will provide narrative responses for outcomes achieved in their APR. Additionally, some projects are transportation service projects, and they will provide additional service data. So what's a transportation service project? That's a project that's associated with a single transportation service, and therefore that recipient can provide service data just about that service. And that data could include rides, revenue hours, revenue miles, contract revenue, fare revenue, other revenue for the service, and all costs associated with the service. And we're going to go through all of those fields during the demo portion of this webinar. Do note that the request for this service data is separate from that APR request that's done on an agency-wide basis. So the APR already asks for agency-wide ridership and revenue hours, revenue miles, for example, and those are requested separately. This is merely focused on the project supported by this specific grant. So I have an example that matches the example I had for project progress. So the outcomes achieved example here would be that the installation of that new bus shelter improved the safety of the bus stop, and the number of boardings at that stop that quarter increased by 5% from the last quarter. So for the next couple of slides, I'm going to dig into outcomes achieved reporting a little bit more, because this is really the most important aspect of STIF discretionary and statewide transit network reporting. It gives us, as well as the legislature, a picture of the benefit of the project and what it was trying to achieve and how well it achieved it. So I circulated a supplemental guidance document on outcomes achieved on December 5th of last year. That document identifies topics of particular interest to public transit and explains where those topics were drawn from. So the first set of topics that it suggests relates to those project selection criteria that were used to evaluate these applications when they were submitted to ODOT. And as a reminder, those criteria included equity in public transportation service to low-income households, coordination of public transportation services, statewide transit network connections, environmental and public health, sustainable funding, meaning how will you fund this project going forward if it exists beyond the biennium, and finally, safety, security, and community livability. Additional suggested topics in that document include topics that were largely derived from the Oregon Public Transportation Plan. So goals within the OPTP include connectivity, including with other modes such as walking and biking, train, other forms of public transportation, accessibility for underserved communities, ease of use of transit, and technological advancements, which we saw a lot of this biennium. There are a lot of recipients who are doing things to develop their data systems and develop technology, both for the benefit of the provider and for the passengers themselves. So a little bit more on outcomes achieved reporting. Why is it so important? Why does this reporting matter? Again, I will note that it relates to the OPTP goals that ODOT has and achieving those goals. Further, it relates to goals of the ODOT administration to really optimize equity and diversity and how that's reflected in projects across the state. And finally, in reporting to the Oregon legislature. Outcomes achieved reporting provides an opportunity to give meaningful stories and content on outcomes achieved to the legislature to indicate and to show how these projects are impacting and improving public transportation across the state and how they're benefiting the public. And as we know, public transportation needs will only increase statewide in the coming years, so it'll become more and more important for this funding to be sustained and increased. And then I also want to touch on the optional biennial outcomes achieved survey. So this was mentioned in reporting guidance, and it is an optional survey to be connected to the final quarter APR. We made this optional to reduce the burden on recipients, and it's going to follow those same topics that you see in the supplemental guidance document in that chart, where we provided both questions and responses to those questions as examples of things that can be reported about for outcomes achieved. This survey will provide the recipient an opportunity to collect all of the responses that they have had throughout the quarter and consolidate them in one place and submit them through the survey mechanism to really show a one picture of the impact throughout the biennium of that project. As to the requirements of what's reported on an outcomes achieved, you don't have to stick to the topics that were identified in this webinar or in the supplemental guidance document. Really, you could talk about any type of benefits that you see to your community based on these projects that you're implementing. Additionally, you could talk about possible future expansions of the project and how those expansions might have additional benefits, which might be relevant to future project selection committees that are looking at requests for additional funding. So I think that's it for outcomes achieved reporting. Here is a simple graphic about documents that are attached to the APR and reimbursement requests. If you want more information about the documentation, that is available on the ODOT website, or you can reach out to myself or Miley Bowles to learn more about documentation submitted through these two portals. So for the APR, you will submit civil rights complaints, outcomes achieved surveys that I just mentioned, DMV accident reports, and then any other documents that were specifically requested through the statements of work for the grant agreement. And so that could, for example, relate to a planning project where the RTC wanted to see steps along in the progress documented to see how that planning process was going. And then for reimbursement requests, the usual things that are requested there, preventative maintenance worksheets and invoices and other expense documentation. So now I'm going to go over the low-income mitigation, tax mitigation reporting requirement. If you are a QE that is participating today, then you will have already heard this content from Linda Veray during the formula reporting, because this is a requirement that exists across all of STIF. So that's the important first note. This is not a requirement that 5311F recipients need to complete. It's only for STIF recipients. And the other piece to remember is that this requirement is the same across all STIF funds and only has to be completed once by each QE or PTSP on an annual basis, so twice within the biennium. So to go over the details, the purpose of the report is to collect actions taken by any PTSPs located within the area of a QE to mitigate the impact of the STIF tax on passengers who reside in low-income communities. And to complete this requirement, the PTSPs will submit a form describing those activities to the appropriate QE, which is generally based on the location of the PTSP, and we'll get to how you know which QE to report to in the next slide, or 2 slides from now, actually. And then the QE will complete a cover letter and a form of their own describing their own actions to reduce the impact on low-income communities. They'll bundle all of the PTSP forms that they receive and submit them in a consolidated report to ODOT. And now that is going to be submitted through the STIF periodic report, the SPR. So that will be submitted along with formula reporting. So here is a snapshot of what the low-income impact mitigation form that PTSPs will complete looks like. Again, this is also available through the link at the bottom of this page and on our website. So this form should be submitted 30 days prior to the fourth quarter SPR deadline of August 14th, 2020, which then submitted to the QE, which then gives the QE time to consolidate all these reports and submit them with their SPR. So the information requested in this form includes the name of the PTSP, and then you select all of the different STIF fund sources that you're receiving in that year. So it could be just formula, or it could be just discretionary, or it could be formula and discretionary and or intercommunity. Next, you will include the name of the QE that it's being sent to, and finally, you'll describe the actions, if any, that the PTSP has taken that year to mitigate the impact of the STIF tax on passengers residing in low-income communities. So we also have a PTSP reference guide, and this is not the complete document here. It's just a snapshot of it as an example, that, as you'll see, provides the names of all the QEs on the left side, and then identifies on the right side which PTSPs should be reporting on this specific topic to which QE. So for just a couple examples, there will be some overlap. For example, COIC and Cascades Westcog, where based on the project and the area of responsibility that project is taking place in or impacting, they might be reporting on this to multiple QEs. All right, so now we're going to do a quick demo of the new additions to the APR for this program. So let me try to pull that up and see if we still have it. Yay, we do. So this is what an APR looks like in Optus. You'll see along the left-hand side, you have all the tabs of the different content. You should be familiar with this. That are submitted on a quarterly basis. So within the grant information tab, you will have populated your STIF and your statewide transit network grants. So they will be alongside other grants, such as federal grants that you receive, but they might appear a little bit differently. So this is an example of a grant that would have qualified as a transportation service project, and thus you'll see that it has this request for service data within it. And so again, that shouldn't be there if it wasn't a transportation service project. First, you'll note that just like in the past, you'll see the grant agreement number and the title, the value of the grant, and then information about how much of the funds within the grant have been expended so far, as well as the start date and the end date. Here, there is an info box that helps you, if you are reporting on service data, it helps you understand what type of data we're looking for in each of those boxes. So it gives you, for example, definitions of these items. So for ridership, for example, ridership is a one-way unlinked passenger trip, i.e. one boarding equals one ride. So that content is there, and you can always reach out to us for additional guidance on service data reporting. So what I'm going to do now to show you a feature of this new section is enter some sample data. So just for context, this fake data is an example of a short intercity route that's supported by a single vehicle. And so the numbers are going to be relatively random, but should give you a sense of the functionality of this. So for example, we had 1248 ridership. We had 286 hours of service, which covered 600, 864 revenue miles. We'll say that it was a fixed route service, but you'll see that you also can select demand response or deviated fixed route. The fare revenue for the quarter was $14.35, and then we'll just say that there wasn't any contract revenue or any other revenue associated. Finally, all costs associated with the service, in this case, were $16,576. So I don't know if you noticed, but while we were entering those numbers, there's a box here that creates calculations for you to provide additional information about the service for the quarter. So it will add up all of the service revenue, and then it'll give you a revenue per revenue mile figure, a cost per revenue mile figure, a cost per ride, and finally the net cost, which is the cost subtracting the revenue. So this is really meant to be a tool for the providers, not only to sort of double check their numbers. You know, if you see these calculations, you say, oh, that doesn't seem right, then maybe something's fishy with your earlier numbers. But it also gives a good picture of how the service is evolving over the biennium. This is not going to be used for a performance measure by ODOT. So this is the only interest in this is to see how the service is changing from quarter to quarter and how it's evolving. So let me make sure I'm not missing anything else on this page. Yes, I wanted to mention as to the service data figures. So if you are a recipient of formula funds, STIF formula funds, then you know that there's a request in the SPR for service data similar to this. That data asks you to calculate up front what the STIF money associated, or what the figure, for example, the ridership associated with just the STIF funds for that formula fund are. Here we're piloting a different approach where you just give us the full information for the quarter, so the full ridership, the full revenue hours, to give a clearer picture, hopefully, of the service. And then if we want to calculate the STIF impact, the STIF discretionary impact on our end, we can. So hopefully this is another place where we're reducing the burden on providers because they don't have to provide that calculation of the STIF impact. And if it works out, then we could potentially include that in formula in the future. So finally, you'll see there's a text box that's not a limited field for project progress, as well as one for outcomes achieved. And note that with the outcomes achieved, there's a link here to that supplemental guidance document. So you can access that as you're reporting for additional support, additional guidance. And then that is it for this addition to the APR. So I will pop back into the webinar before we take questions. There's a couple more slides on here that could be helpful to you. Here are links to the resources that were mentioned during today's webinar. Again, these are on the STIF website as well. For APR technical assistance, you can contact your appropriate support analysts, which are all listed here. If your assistance is more content related, then it's best to reach out to your RTC, meaning you want to know how to report on something. And then finally, there's a slide on the STIF program contacts, including myself, David Graff, and Karen Criswell. And I think I'm just going to leave it on this slide as we take questions. I think that's it for the content.
Excellent. So our first question is, will we be able to print the PowerPoint?
Yes, I will upload the PowerPoint to the STIF website today, and you should be able to print it from there.
And our second question is, what is required as support for reserves, specifically operating reserves to maintain increases in service/program?
I'm going to let an RTC who's in the room step in on this one. Mark Bernard.
So with respect to operating reserves, what immediately jumps to mind is what amounts to a burden to sustain service, particularly if your discretionary or statewide transit network grant, intercommunity grant was for expanded service. And in those cases, the method that I have been recommending to providers in my area is to establish, if you haven't already done so, a contingency account in your STIF formula, in your STIF plan. And that would be a source of reserves for the projects that you have endeavored to complete through the discretionary and the intercommunity funding silos. The other way I would imagine that you could endeavor to have a reserve for these sorts of projects would be if you actually note that in future grant cycles under these programs. Really, I think the easiest way to affect that is through the QE's STIF plan.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Our next question is, could you provide more detail on expense documentation? We are new to Optus and the APR.
Let me pull that one back up so people can look at it. And then I'm going to have Miley Bowles, one of our Optus experts, speak on that.
This is real general, the graph or graphic that's on here. We also have a multi-page document that's on our website, I'm not exactly sure where, that talks about each category of expense and what documentation is required. And then I think we even have like a one-pager that kind of summarizes that also. So I can pull those, maybe we could post it when you post the webinar, the PowerPoint or whatever, because that information is on our website. I just can't direct them to it right now.
I'm sure we could duplicate it for the STIF page, and you can also reach out directly to me and or Miley to receive that information.
Yep.
Excellent. Our next question is, if we're using a subcontractor and they're submitting invoices on a fixed fee basis rather than quarterly, when do we report their expenses?
Could you read the sentence again, or the question again?
Yes. If we're using a subcontractor and they're submitting invoices on a fixed fee basis rather than quarterly, when do we report their expenses?
I think you would just report them quarterly based on that quarter's, you know, take 12 divided by 4 or whatever. Does that make sense?
Right. So I'm thinking the question is asking or saying that they would be paying for more than a quarter at once for the subcontractor. Right. So it should follow your expenses, right? So it should follow when those funds are expended by the recipient.
I would look as an RTC, this is Mark Bernard, I would look as an RTC at the expenses for an event. Because we're going to be matching these up with the documentation that supports the expense, and those documents are likely be invoices or something similar to that, and those invoices would be event driven. So that's how I would deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Next question. Can you give a few examples of low income mitigation actions?
Sure. That could be, for example, a provider increases service in a municipality that, so I guess I should back up. The low-income mitigation impact QE form asks the QE to reiterate their method for calculating low-income populations. Correct, David? And so really it's going to be based on how the QE established that definition. And then once they had identified those populations, then, for example, an example of a PTSP action could have been increasing service in an area that was identified as a low-income community.
Excellent. Next question. Are we able to report on multiple projects in one APR?
Yes. All of if you, for example, have multiple STIF discretionary projects, they should all appear under the grant information tab of the APR.
Great. We have another logistics question. Will these slides be available for access after the presentation?
Yes.
Great. Next question. Will the ODOT agreement number be already entered in Optus, or should we register in the system prior to submitting our first APR?
You will not need to, because yes, it will populate into that tab for you. So on that example demo I showed, the grant agreement number that was there populated into that space rather than was typed into it.
Another Optus question. Is there a character limit for the project progress and outcomes achieved text boxes? And if so, what is that character limit?
There is no limit.
That is all the questions we have so far.
Okay, great.
I'd just like to say, this is Miley again. If you are new to Optus, there's a lot to learn, and the slide that Patrick showed with the support analyst in your region, if you would contact that person, they can set up anything from coming out to your agency and giving you some training to just a short, on the phone, kind of work you through your first report or reimbursement request or whatever, or even a couple hour group session or something. So just reach out to the support analyst and they can get you going in Optus.
And additionally, on that note, the original reporting guidance, so not the supplemental piece, but the first reporting guidance document that was given to recipients for this program included links to Optus and APR 101 type documents. So that might be a good place to start as well. Anything else?
We have one more question.
Okay.
And I think we may have a few more come in as we're getting close to wrapping up the webinar. Will you publish FAQs along with the PowerPoint after this webinar?
Does that mean the questions that were asked in the webinar? Or...
Yeah, so we can publish a written version of the questions if you'd like to.
Yes, so we can do that. In terms of, RPTD created FAQs, I'm hoping that the guidance materials should answer any questions you have, and if not, you can reach out directly to me.
We have a comment that is, we appreciate Maggie in Region 5.
I'll let her know. Thank you.
All right, one more trickling in. Will we need to submit all invoices that pertain to STIF projects?
Miley, do you have
I am.
Oh,
sorry.
well, we need to submit all invoices that pertain to STIF projects.
Well, it's refer to the documents that I mentioned, and it explains exactly what you need to submit. Like, for instance, for preventive maintenance, we don't necessarily want every single receipt for every oil change and, purchase, but we have a worksheet that you could fill out. So it really depends on the type of expense as to what you need to submit, and I'll make sure you get those documents.
Thank you.
Excellent. That is it on questions.
Okay, and all the participants are welcome to follow up following the webinar with any additional questions they might have, and look for these resources on the STIF website in the next week. Thank you very much.